Okay, this one's going to be heavy. Let me talk to you today about choices, or more specifically about the choices that people sometimes make to end their own lives. Recently, Kim Leadbeater, the MP from Spen Valley in the UK, introduced private members' legislation to permit people to end their life with physician assistance. Let's call this medical assistance in dying. Her bill was introduced in October, passed its first reading, and as of the 29th of November 2024, a couple weeks prior to filming this video, passed its second reading to, let's say, mixed reception. I'm concerned in this video with that reception, and specifically with an argument that has become increasingly prevalent among the left, the traditional defenders of bodily autonomy, those whom we might expect to promote and defend people's access to medical assistance in dying. Increasingly, however, they are becoming critics, and in this video, I want to explore why they are becoming critics and why they are wrong. I am Fabien Caillet. Welcome to Without Passage. Let me begin with some context. Leadbeater's terminally ill patients' end-of-life bill is not the first of its kind. It is explicitly modeled on earlier legislation passed in my own home country, in Canada, that broadly achieves the same ends, with the same restrictions and the same safeguards. Much of the controversy that has surrounded Leadbeater's bill, then, is actually borrowed controversy from Canada's legislation. In order to understand this controversy, then, I actually want to trace its origin in the Canadian context, recognizing an important difference. In Canada, unlike the UK, medical assistance in dying legislation has been mostly in response to several lawsuits that had been brought forward against the federal government in several of its provinces by disabled people and disability rights advocates in order to force the government to respect the autonomous choices of those disabled people who wish to choose to end their own life with medical assistance. And I want to begin in 1993 with the case of Sue Rodriguez versus the government of British Columbia. In 1991, Sue Rodriguez was diagnosed with ALS, or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. ALS is a neurodegenerative disorder that contributes to loss of motor functioning, beginning with muscle stiffness, muscle weakness, muscle twitches, etc., and gradually leading to the inability to eat, to speak, to move, and eventually to breathe. People with ALS invariably, in every single case, suffer a terrifying, horrible, painful death in which over months, weeks, days, and eventually hours, they asphyxiate. They struggle to breathe until they die. This happens in every case. There is no avoiding it. There is some drugs that will delay the inevitable. There are drugs that will alleviate some of the pain, but the outcome is always the same. For Sue Rodriguez, this was intolerable, and so she sought a physician's help to end her life. In Canada at the time, according to Criminal Code Section 241, it was illegal to aid and abet the suicide of another individual. Now, as such, Sue Rodriguez found it very difficult to find a physician willing to help her end her life for obvious reasons. And so as a consequence, she sued the government in order that she be able to access physician-assisted suicide legally. Her case is based on 3 sections of Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Section 7, which concerns the rights to life, liberty, and security of person. Section 12, which concerns constitutional protections against cruel and unusual treatment. And Section 15, subsection 1, which concerns constitutional protections against discrimination on the basis of age, race, sex, disability, etc. Her argument is basically this. She suffers from a grievous and irremediable medical disorder. She knows how the rest of her life is going to go, and she finds that to be intolerable. As the person who bears the right to life, she wants to end it. Now, there are 2 ways that this can go. She can either take matters into her own hands, as it were, and use a firearm, jump in front of a subway train, jump off a bridge, poison herself, light herself on fire. There are so many different ways that this could go. or she could access some kind of physician assistance. One of those is clearly preferable. Using a firearm or jumping in front of a train or what have you is unreliable, it is dangerous, and it often causes harm to other people. Physician assistance does not have those same risks. People can reliably and safely and comfortably die with physician assistance. The problem is that according to Canada's criminal code, only one of those is legal, and it is not the safer and more reliable option. As such, Sue Rodriguez is being forced to undergo a kind of cruel choice to do the thing that she knows is less safe and less reliable, and it's the thing that also causes other harms to other people. Because she is also disabled as someone with ALS, she must make this choice earlier than maybe she would like to, while she is still physically capable of using a firearm or jumping in front of a train or what have you.
Mrs. Rodriguez wishes to exert control over the last days of her life, her body, so that she may die with dignity as a terminally ill but able-bodied person is able to do.
All of this comes together, as far as she is concerned, to say that it is unjust for and unconstitutional for the government of Canada to prevent her from accessing physician assistance to die. The court disagreed. The court argued that it is consistent with the fundamental principle of justice to prevent people from committing suicide with physician assistance. And it argued that on the basis essentially of saying that it is a fundamental societal value to preserve the dignity of life. The Rodriguez decision would define the state of Canadian jurisprudence on the matter of assisted dying for the better part of 2 decades. But that obviously wasn't the end of the matter, otherwise we wouldn't be here. In that time, various private members' bills would be introduced trying to legalize physician-assisted suicide. All were defeated. The Senate would conduct some kind of task force to try to study the matter and best implement it, and all the while people continued to contract grievous and irremediable medical disorders such as ALS, such as MS, such as cancer, and so many others, and try to effect some kind of control over the rest of their life, and in fact also their death. As a consequence, you had a legion of disabled people and disability rights advocates pushing to have the law changed. And while that was happening, people would then go to Europe, to the Netherlands, to Belgium, to Switzerland, in order to end their life there, assuming they had the financial means. Many people did not. One of those people would be Gloria Taylor. She suffered from ALS just like Sue Rodriguez before her, but lacking any financial means to go to Europe to end her life there, she'd be forced to make a choice here in Canada. She could either choose to end her life while she was still physically capable by some yet to be determined and probably dangerous and uncertain means, or she could surrender control over her life to Canada's medical system, where she would die a terrible, horrible, painful, and yet natural death by asphyxiation. She didn't want to do either of those things, so she brought a suit to the government in order that she be able to access physician's assistance to die when she was ready. And that court is known as Carter versus Canada. It was decided in 2015, and it was decided essentially on the same grounds as Rodriguez put forward in 1993. Nevertheless, the court did decide in Taylor's favor and in Carter's in 2015, whereas the 1993 Supreme Court of British Columbia argued that the prohibition on physician-assisted suicide did not violate, and in fact was consistent with, the fundamental principles of justice. The later Supreme Court of Canada would disagree, and the central move that they would make would be to consider the decision point, the choice to end a person's life, from the perspective of the person suffering a grievous and irremediable medical condition, and not from the society in which they suffer. The person suffering did have a choice to make. They could choose to end their life while they are still physically capable by some unreliable, dangerous, and harmful means, as previously described, or they could live on in a condition that they deemed intolerable until their natural death.
If I could use my hands, I'd get my gun and shoot myself. And I can't use my hands anymore.
The court judged that that was a cruel choice to force a person to make, and the government could not legally, constitutionally force a person to make that choice. As such, the court would force the government to provide some kind of legal framework in order that a person access physician-assisted suicide. And Parliament did this with Bill C-14 in 2016. Bill C-14 would legalize medical assistance in dying, or MAiD, for people who met certain conditions. A person would have to submit an application that certified that they were at least 18 years old, that they suffered a grievous and irremediable medical condition, that they were competent to make informed medical choices, that this choice was voluntary and not the result of external coercion, that this choice was informed, which is to say that they have received all available information concerning alternative treatment options, including palliative care, and this is the important part, that their death was reasonably foreseeable, which is to say that they expected to die within the next 6 months. All of this would have to be co-signed by a witness and at least 2 independent physician assessments. In 2019, Jean Truchon and Nicolas Gladieux would sue the government of Canada again in order to access medical assistance in dying for themselves, despite the fact that their death was not reasonably foreseeable. Truchon had cerebral palsy and Gladieux had post-polio syndrome, and they alleged that the government was discriminating against them on the basis of their disability to prevent them from accessing medical assistance in dying. They were competent to make their own choices, they knew what they were doing, and so they sought to end their life with physician's assistance, but the government was preventing them from doing so. And they sued, they won their case, and the government was then forced to make a choice. They would either appeal that decision to another court, to the Supreme Court of Canada in this case, or they would amend the law. The government chose to amend the law, and so began Canada's medical assistance in dying expansion, and that is where a great deal of the controversy lies. Canada's MAiD expansion was accomplished by 2021's Bill C-7. That bill did not only remove the restriction on people whose death was not reasonably foreseeable, it also foresaw several important court challenges and so provided a sunset clause on restrictions pending further study of people who suffer a grievous and irremediable mental disorder, not simply a physical disorder. It also empowered a panel to study that issue. That panel was concluded. They provided 19 recommendations on how the government may ethically and effectively regulate and safeguard that issue, but it also provided a great deal of controversy.
How could this be true? You know?
Now, much of this controversy actually just misunderstands how the law works. For example, just because someone is poor and might not have great access to medical care doesn't mean they can apply for MAiD. They actually have to meet the conditions that are set out. They have to have a grievous and irremediable medical disorder already. They actually have to be assessed by 2 independent physicians. They actually have to be competent to make informed medical choices. That choice has to be voluntary and not the result of external pressure or coercion. If you're applying on the basis of poverty alone, you will not be accepted. You will not be permitted to access medical assistance in dying. Likewise for just ordinary disability. And there have been lots of people who have misunderstood this.
Are we to believe that if the court strikes down the law and allows physician-assisted dying in extremely limited ways, that we're going to have doctors on a killing spree? I mean, that's really what they're asking us to believe, and that's ridiculous.
A great deal of this misunderstanding, as far as I can tell, arises from the mistaken assumption that the government doesn't merely permit a person to end their own life with physician assistance, but obligates them to. Now, this simply isn't the case. The government merely provides a regulatory framework that provides safeguards to prevent people who are not in the right mind, or who are being coerced, or who do not, in fact, possess some kind of grievous and irremediable medical condition from ending their own life prematurely. Now, whatever we might think about whether those safeguards are too permissive or too restrictive, that is how matters stand. The complications arise, however, in the fact that the government is also providing those physicians, in a sense, because we have single-payer Medicare. And this is where we meet also the UK context. Leadbeater's terminally ill patients end-of-life bill is a slightly more restrictive version of Canada's 2016 Bill C-14. That's prior to the MAiD expansion in 2021. It restricts medical assistance in dying to people who meet the following conditions: that they are 18 years or older, that they have a grievous and irremediable medical condition, that their death is reasonably foreseeable, that they are competent to make informed decisions free of coercion, that they have made 2 independent declarations of intent, that they have provided 2 independent physician assessments, that they have had a hearing with a high court judge, and that they have passed a 2-week delay in which time they can revoke consent. That bill has passed its second reading, and now the controversy has really started for it. And in that controversy, I want to focus on one specific case: the comments of one Jeremy Corbyn. Now, Jeremy Corbyn is probably the UK's most famous left-wing politician. He is, in some sense, the voice of the left in the UK. What he says becomes definitive and kind of canonical left-wing fare. So when he critiques Leadbeater's bill, his critique is, in some sense, the left-wing critique. And this is a problem here, because his critique is bad. He misunderstands the issue. He misunderstands what it means to end your own life as someone with a grievous and irremediable medical condition, with a grievous and irremediable disability. And so what I want to do is go through his critique in some detail to really understand what can be learned from this, not only about decisions for end-of-life care, but also about the political role of the state in that process. These are his comments dated the 29th of November, 2024. Thank you to all those who have written to me about the terminally ill adults end-of-life bill. I wanted to take the time to explain why I will be voting against the legislation. I understand why many people feel so passionately about their right to die when suffering from a terminal illness. Under the existing system, people endure real, lasting, and unbearable pain. That includes those who are seriously or terminally ill, as well as those around them. Nobody should face indignity in death. Any legislation of this kind must robustly safeguard against abuse and guarantee that those who are seriously ill would not feel coerced or pressured to prematurely end their life. I am not satisfied that this legislation provides these safeguards, and that is why I cannot support it. Choice at the end of life can only be meaningful in a system where everybody has access to the best palliative care possible, but chronic underfunding has left many of those suffering from terminal illness without the support they need. Without addressing these deficiencies, this legislation puts the poorest, the elderly, and disabled people at risk of serious neglect and discrimination. We urgently need to address the appalling state of palliative care by reversing years of austerity and privatization. This should be part of a broader imperative to build a national care service freely available to all who need it, whenever they need it, wherever they need it. This would be a care system that treats those with serious illness and disability not as burdens, but as people whose lives have equal worth. As history shows us, legislation on complex matters can have serious societal repercussions. I do not believe today's procedures allow for the kind of debate and scrutiny that is required for legislation of this importance. I would welcome an independent review on the existing law and a public consultation on proposals for change. I remain open to people's views on this important issue, knowing how much work there is to be done to guarantee care and dignity for all. Jeremy Corbyn, Independent MP for Islington North.
Thanks, but no thanks.
Much of what Corbyn is saying there is reasonable. It's admirable, even. The NHS has experienced decades of austerity and underfunding. That is simply true. The care that it can provide, including palliative care to terminally ill patients, is not up to snuff. People are not receiving the care that they deserve. The question that arises, however, is how much that should affect the permissions or restrictions on whether a patient, a terminally ill patient who everyone knows will die within the next 6 months and die grievously, can end their own life on their own terms. Corbyn thinks that in the present system, in the present state of the NHS, with its underfunding problem, that choice cannot be meaningful.
I hate to say it that way, but where does the government get off thinking they have a right to tell me how to die? I'm the one that's dying, not them.
If this isn't my decision to make, whose is it? Who has a greater right to decide this for me? And what presumption, what arrogance of theirs could justify it?
In the case of Gloria Taylor or Sue Rodriguez or Kay Carter in Canada, those people were competent to make their own decisions. They knew the course of the rest of their life. They knew what was going to happen. The fact that Canada's medical care system was underfunded in all three of those cases simply didn't matter to them. Even if it was ideally funded, they knew what was coming. They knew that every single day was going to be worse than the previous. They knew that they would progressively get weaker and weaker and weaker until, as Kay Carter put it, their body would collapse upon itself. They knew what was happening. The state of medical funding doesn't affect that at all. Now, let's not be too hard on Corbyn here, although I am so inclined. Choices are difficult.
Do you think it's easy to make priorities?
The choice that a person might make to end their own life is the most difficult and most important choice that a person might ever make. It is the duty of government to ensure that this choice is not made flippantly, that the choice is not made in some way against a person's interests or against their welfare or in some way against their will, whatever we take that to mean. Corbyn is right to question whether the safeguards that are being put in place are sufficient. The problem is that the process that Leadbeater's bill sets out is extremely lengthy and it is extremely difficult. You have to make two independent declarations of intent. You have to get two independent physician assessments. You have to appear before a high court judge. That all takes time. And this is all after qualifying in the first place. You have to have a grievous and irremediable condition that causes you to suffer great harm. You have to have a reasonably foreseeable death. You only have 6 months in order for this process to go forward. Many people will die before the process is completed. That happens in Canada. Roughly 15% of people die before the government accepts their application for medical assistance in dying. That isn't really the problem here, but that also isn't really what Corbyn is talking about. Now, is it? There's an important distinction to be made, and I think this is really what Corbyn's comments are getting at, between whether someone qualifies for medical assistance in dying according to the letter of the law and whether someone will actually make that choice. Not everyone who qualifies, after all, is going to make that choice, and not everyone who would like to make that choice actually qualifies. What we really need to ask about is the motivations that people have for ending their own life with physician's assistance. That is what really makes a choice meaningful, and that's the central issue that is at play here. Surveys show, in Canada and elsewhere, that people sometimes make this choice because of concerns that are orthogonal, as it were, to their actual medical condition. They make it on the basis of poverty, or that they feel like a burden to other people. They lack social supports or economic supports in order to live the rest of their life meaningfully. And so they seek to end it instead. Corbyn alleges essentially that those choices are not meaningful, that medical assistance in dying is not a just response to a system that forces people into that situation, that forces them to make their choices on the basis of poverty or a lack of social supports. But why should we really think this? If it's just a matter that people are being forced, as it were, to make this choice, well, strictly speaking, that's not true. There's lots of people in poverty or that are lonely, that lack social supports, that feel like a burden or that might feel like a burden, who don't end up making that choice for whatever reason.
I live one day at a time, and sometimes an hour at a time, and sometimes literally a breath at a time. And I don't go there very often. I am absolutely not afraid to die. I'm not in denial that I'm going to die. I know what my options are today to die. Am I prepared to take that option today? No, because life is good today. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. Could be totally different.
But in addition to that, even if we think that, a strict notion of causation is not relevant here, that there's just a prevalence that is enough to motivate a skepticism about whether this choice is meaningful or not, we need to remember what situation these people are in the first place. They are essentially being forced to make this choice on the basis of their medical condition. They suffer from a grievous and irremediable disease or disability. It is something that affects their life deeply. They suffer deeply. They will never recover. The fact that they are also poor just adds to their suffering. The fact that they are also lonely just adds to their suffering. The fact that they lack the supports from their state or their family or their friends just adds to their suffering. But what does that really mean? What we are doing by saying that suffering has been added to their choice is saying that we must now force them to live on with more suffering. Their suffering must continue, and it is being added to. Why not allow them then to make the choice and decide for themselves whether it is meaningful? If the choice cannot be meaningful, if they are forced into it, quote unquote, by external circumstances, then the choice to end their life will never be meaningful. There is, in a sense, no ethical dying under capitalism. But that's ridiculous, isn't it? That's just an excuse for inaction. That's just an excuse to force people to continue to suffer, to continue to live on in conditions that they themselves deem to be intolerable. When we say that there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, what that means is that we are excused from continuing on an unjust or otherwise unethical economic relationship, that we are excused from purchasing products from Tesla or Amazon or Microsoft or Starbucks or what have you, that have contributed to unjust labor practices, that have contributed to the degradation of the environment, that have contributed to unjust monopolies or the genocide in Palestine or Sudan or elsewhere. We can do other things with our money. Maybe it's impossible to find a real business that is truly ethical, but we can always choose the better over the worse. And we can do that here too. When maybe it's not possible to, in the present state of the UK, to really eliminate the possibility that a person chooses to end their life because they are just sick and tired of being poor, of not being able to afford rent or food or electricity or what have you. Maybe it's not possible to eliminate the possibility that a person chooses to end their life because they don't have good access to palliative care, because they don't have appropriate social or economic supports. But what do we really do in that situation? Do we just force them to continue on living in that situation? They think that this is intolerable to them, intolerable enough that they wish to completely end their life, to completely escape from that condition.
Palliative care to me is just stoning me out of my mind till I don't know what's going on. Well, if you call that care, if you cared about me, you'd put me out of my misery. Don't care about me, and that's the thing that gets me about the doctor's oath, do no harm. Well, they're doing me harm by keeping me alive at that end, when it gets to that stage. That's where the harm is.
So what do? I think that we should just trust disabled and vulnerable people. We should give them their humanity and their dignity to allow them to be autonomous moral agents. And I think that by voting against Leadbeater's bill, Jeremy Corbyn risks stripping that from disabled and vulnerable people, of stripping them the dignity that they are deserved. There is really only one way for a person to die in indignity, and it is to die in a way that they do not consent to. It is to live on when they want to die, or to die when they want to live on. Let us not strip away the dignity of disabled and vulnerable people. Let us allow them to make their own end-of-life decisions.
I don't want to be a bunch of bones laying in bed.